Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and this is our final election special podcast. Over the last few weeks, we've brought you episodes focused on loads of the big issues facing the country, from levelling up and local government to schools and tax reform. In this episode, which we're recording in a week before Election Day, we want to answer some of the questions that we've had from listeners. To help give you some information perhaps you need before you head to the polls. We've got questions here from people listening into the podcast, from IFS members, questions that we've received via YouTube, and quite a number also that we got at our manifesto launch event earlier this week, but didn't have time to answer then. I am, as ever, joined by some of the UK's leading economists, it says here, aka my colleagues. Carl Emerson, Helen Miller and Christine Farquharson, and who could be better to answer some of these really key questions. We've got lots and lots. We'll try and get through a few of them, and we're picking out the hard ones, I'm afraid, because I think they're the most interesting. So here's a question from an IFS member. It's one that we are often asked, and it's a really important one. And the question is, why can't we borrow our way out of the challenges faced and borrow to drive growth? That's a tough one, Carl, so I'm going to ask you.
Well, I think there you've got to remember that if we could borrow more, we could let debt rise for a bit longer. Both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party want to have debt falling in 5 years' time, so lower at the end of year 5 than at year 4. There's nothing special in economics about that. It would be pretty reasonable to say, well, why don't we have it falling between year 7 and 8, for example? Now, if we were doing that borrowing to pay for lower taxes, so we got to enjoy lower tax bills or more day-to-day spending, I think that would have a short-term boost to growth, quite possibly, but it wouldn't do anything to the size of the economy in the longer term. And you might question why we should be borrowing more money, pushing more onto debt, just so we get to enjoy lower taxes now and future generations end up paying more in debt interest. If we were to borrow the money to spend more on investment and we were confident that we could spend that money well and get a decent return from it, either in terms of a bigger economy in the future or other things that we might rather have in the future, so for example, progress towards net zero, then it's perfectly reasonable, because you could say, well, future generations would say, well, yes, you gave us a bit more debt because you borrowed some money, but actually we're glad you did that because of what you spent the money on. It's left us perhaps with a slightly bigger economy or with a better situation in some other dimension. So you could borrow more, but I think you'd have to be confident that it was delivering not just benefits now, but also benefits in the future.
And I think that also comes on to something we're often asked, which is, oh, well, shouldn't we be reclassifying, for example, our education spending as investment, or our health spending as investment, or our pension spending as investment, or on and on and on? And none of those things is necessarily wrong on its own merits. Investment doesn't have to be a physical building or a physical road. Social investment absolutely can drive returns. But the question becomes, well, are you doing that just to get around the fiscal rules you've set yourself, or are you doing that because there really is a clear, credible economic case to think that this is going to be spending that benefits future generations rather than just spending that we quite like to enjoy today?
Yeah, and I think you also have to answer, why are we doing more borrowing on a temporary basis? Is there some reason why we think that's credible, that actually we won't be just borrowing more forevermore? Because although obviously we can, and I think it's pretty clear we can push up debt a bit more, there's no reason why it has to fall between year 4 and 5. What you can't do is have debt growing faster than your economy forever. At some point, somebody's going to say to you, I don't want to lend you the money, or is going to demand a prohibitive price on lending the UK government money. So you can borrow more for a bit, but it really has to be credible. And if you start relabeling lots and lots of public spending as investment and then saying, oh, it's okay to borrow for all of that, I think it's not clear why you'd suddenly decide in 5 or 6 years' time, no, now's the moment where we're actually going to pay for this stuff out of tax revenue.
There's one of the reasons I was, I suppose, slightly surprised that Labour has signed up to exactly the same targets as the Conservatives. An alternative, let's put this out here, an alternative might have been for Rachel Reeves to say, look, I'm inheriting an absolute mess. We've had 14 years, this is Rachel Reeves speaking, not me. We've inherited a mess after 14 years of the Conservatives. I'm absolutely focused on getting debt down over time, but just to help us get out of this mess over the next few years, I'm willing to see debt rise to maybe 5 percentage points of GDP higher than it's currently due to. After that, we're going to start getting it down. But for now, I'm going to invest in getting the economy growing, getting our infrastructure going. Now, the downside is exactly what Carl said. Is that credible? It's easy to say, I'm going to borrow more now, grow the economy now, and then, honest, I promise, I'll start getting it down in the future. And I think that's the sort of that's the difficult trap that politicians can get into, because even if that was the right thing to do, and it might well be, how do you actually make that a credible promise?
Lots of our public services are struggling. Lots of our infrastructure is struggling. We have net zero. Is there a credible argument to make at this point? Is this point in time special? Could we make the argument that now is a time to do investment?
I think you could make that argument. I think you could have made that argument lots of times in the past. I mean, that's part of the issue with credibility. I mean, we know that the economy has been growing incredibly slowly for a long period of time. We know that good investment is good for economic growth. We know that there is a slew of issues across public services. But you could also argue, well, if you know all that, well, why, as Carl was saying, push the cost of all that onto future generations? If that's what the population really wants, if they want their potholes filled and their schools, the teachers well paid and so on, shouldn't they be paying through their own tax? And I think one of the things that I think is difficult about a lot of this conversation is often it's just seen as a way of getting out of some of the difficult things that we face at the moment. And it is worth saying, I mean, we do need to remember the extent to which borrowing isn't free, which we really should remember at the moment, because we are spending a colossal amount on debt interest at the moment. And that's actually one of the reasons why there's not much money to spend on other things. In fact, it's the main reason or one of the main reasons that things look difficult elsewhere. So I think that often this discussion kind of bleeds into a sense that borrowing is a free lunch, and in the end it isn't a free lunch. That's not to say that we couldn't do more of it. How much we worry about, learn from, use as a cautionary tale what happened in the so-called mini budget of September 2022, because there are certainly plenty of people out there who will say, look, I mean, this was an increase of borrowing of only in £45 billion. That's less than 2% of national income, and that caused absolute chaos. What can we learn from that?
I think you have to remember that there was a whole combination of things going on at that moment in time. So it wasn't just a government saying we want to cut your taxes by £45 billion a year. It was a government that said that it wasn't very happy with the Bank of England. It was a government that had sacked the permanent secretary to the Treasury. It had deliberately chosen not to accept and publish a set of forecasts from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. And it made no attempt to try and show how that £45 billion a year would be paid for. It didn't want to say whether it would be paid for by higher borrowing or through lower spending. And in addition, they gave the suggestion that this was for starters and they would be going further. So I think what they generated was not just £45 billion a year of extra borrowing. They generated a huge amount of uncertainty about how much money they'd be borrowing in the future. And I think that's what markets really do not like. They generated an environment where it wasn't going to be clear to people what their strategy was, and a lot of uncertainty. And that leads to, for example, the people are demanding more money or a higher return if they're going to lend the UK government money. And that's what caused the government problem. So I'm not saying, I'm sure the 45 billion was big enough to be part of the story, but the rest of those components, I think, were also an important part of it. So I think if you wanted to do a 45 billion tax cut and you didn't do all those other things, you might have found it much, much easier to do.
It's a really important. It's also worth saying at the same time, there are huge amounts of money thrown at the energy price spike, more, I think, than nearly any other country. So there's a lot more borrowing happening in any case. But I think that is actually a really important response, as it were, to those who say that is proof that even, that substantial, but in the terms of the economy, relatively modest increases of borrowing are not manageable. Actually, that wasn't necessarily the lesson of that period. I think the lesson, as Carl says, was that appearing not to care very much about the fiscal situation, alongside lots of extra borrowing, can be quite problematic. Let's move on to another question, which I think came from our look at the manifestos earlier this week. We talked about the possibility that a lot of the gloom that we were dispensing might not happen, and it might not. I mean, it really might not. Things might turn out much better. And so we said the next government might get lucky, and if the next government gets lucky, then maybe they won't need to increase taxes or cut spending. What is it? What do we mean by getting? I mean, the questioner asked, "What does it mean to get lucky? What would need to happen for us to get lucky?"
Everything we've talked about is based on a set of forecasts about what will happen in the future to the size of the economy and to economic growth. And it's under those central forecasts that we've basically said that the next government's going to have to either cut spending, raise taxes, or accept higher borrowing and not getting debt falling down so quickly. But we don't know what's actually going to happen in 5 years' time. So getting lucky is that something makes that picture better. But the obvious thing to get lucky on would be economic growth. So the economy turns out actually to have been bigger than we thought it was going to be now. A bigger economy would be better for all sorts of reasons. It would drag in more tax revenue and would mean that basically the government has more money, more resources at its disposal. And if it's got lucky enough, if growth went up by enough, it would not have to make one of those choices. It could spend the money shoring up public services if it needed to, for example. So that's the kind of getting lucky here means that you avoid the choice that we've set out just because the economy ends up being brighter and perkier than it otherwise would be. But I think as we, and I guess especially as Carl has shown, of course, people do get lucky, but unlucky, you can get unlucky too. And, equally the economy could turn out to be less rosy than we thought. The economy could be smaller than we thought. And that would leave us with an even bigger hole than we think we already have. And I think, as we said in this podcast before, the OBR is actually a relatively optimistic forecaster among forecasters, certainly more optimistic than the Bank of England. So if the Bank of England turns out to be right about the future path of the economy, then the size of the problem we'll face will be bigger rather than smaller. So as you said, we could get lucky, but certainly not guaranteed.
And I think an important part of it being framed as luck as well is we've heard a lot in this election about, what we're going to do, our plan is we're going to get growth going. We're going to push the growth button. And that almost posits growth as something that's directly under Westminster's control 100% of the time. Now, absolutely, there are things that the government can do to make conditions more favourable for growth, to improve the central estimates of those forecasts, to make the outlook rosier. Absolutely, that's true. But a big part of what's going on in the economy is also stuff that is completely outside the government's control. That might be things that are outside the government's control that happen here, like the weather or the pandemic. It might be foreign events. It might be Putin decides to invade Ukraine, or it might be a next version of a global pandemic, or it might be some sort of another ship gets stuck in the Suez Channel. So there are all kinds of factors that weigh on this, and only a small portion of those factors are directly under our control. So luck really genuinely can just mean luck. Something happened to you that you didn't cause.
And I think that's important looking backwards as well as looking forwards. I'm not saying this to defend the record of the current government, but a lot of the slow growth that we've experienced in the UK since 2007, 2008, which of course most has been on the watch of this government, is not so dramatically different to what a lot of other countries have experienced over this period. There's been certainly across the developed world, a real slowdown in productivity growth. Now, to some extent, it's been a bit worse here, and there's been a lot of policy errors here. So some of this is the fault of the government. They've also got unlucky in the sense of coming in after the financial crisis, in the sense of having COVID and so on. It's not so much luck which drove some of the cuts in investment spending, Brexit, political chaos and all those other things which have also been a drag on growth.
I think it's fair to say that slowdown in growth that we've seen in the UK for sure, also to some extent elsewhere, we don't really know why. So because we don't really know why, it's therefore a little bit hard to answer the question, well, why might it persist? Or why might we actually just bounce out of it and go back to how we were growing before? There aren't very good economic models of why is it that the amount we're producing per hour is suddenly going up at a slower rate than it used to? That's just not something we have much knowledge about.
Related to that, one of the questions is about how innovative we are and whether innovation is going to pick up or become more productive. And there are big unknowns there. And as I think you were saying, Carl, we don't quite know why that may have got slower than it was before. But also things like AI. We've got AI. one of the big unknowns is, will that revolutionise productivity? Will we all become more productive? Will it be great? Or actually, will it not happen? So there's just a lot of an uncertainty about how some of these technologies that are coming, either how quickly they'll be developed and then how quickly they'll be rolled out and turn into ultimately, income and living standards.
And do listen to some of our podcasts past to get an in-depth discussion about what we think might drive growth. We had a conversation a few weeks ago with Anna Valero of the LSE, which was very much focused on that. There's another question here about one of the things that we said, or in particular I said, during the our manifesto analysis, which was, and the question is asking, what did we mean by saying that the suggestions by some of the smaller parties, and we were looking particularly at Reform and the Greens, were, quotes, in danger of poisoning the debate. Let's give a bit of background to that and try and get some sense of what it was we meant by that. So Reform has a manifesto which includes what they say is £90 billion worth of tax cuts. Actually, by our calculations, it's much bigger than that. So absolutely enormous tax cuts, and an extra £50 billion or so of public spending on things that we like the health service, and claims to be able to pay for that by a combination of entirely unspecified cuts to public spending on waste and on welfare, and also by reducing the amount we spend on debt interest by changing the way the Bank of England remunerates the debt that's held there. So this looks marvellous, doesn't it? I mean, big tax cuts, big spending increases on things that we like, paid for in a way that is essentially unspecified and looks painless. Now, of course, that is not in any sense a credible statement of intent. Not because it's impossible to have a smaller state. It may well be possible to have a smaller state, but if you want a smaller state, then you need to spell out how you're going to get it, because getting there will be painful. It will mean, for example, and these are not proposals that we are getting behind, but of the scale of means testing the state pension, means testing access to the National Health Service, dramatically reducing even further the things that local government does, really big cuts to the levels of benefits that sick and disabled people, for example, get. I mean, that is the sort of scale of change that you would need to make those sums add up. And so the problem there, I think, is that you've got something which looks lovely, looks nice and radical, but is wholly not set out in terms of what its justification would be, and it makes the other parties look a bit boring and bland when actually they're arguably being sensible. The Greens, in a sense, are looking in exactly the opposite direction, whereas Reform is saying they want a smaller state, but they're not setting out how they would get there. The Greens are talking about a much bigger state. They're talking about their total additional spending at the end of the Parliament. I think it'll be something like £250 billion a year. Now, that's enormous. That's a 20% increase in the amount that the state spends. Again, completely reasonable. Lots of other Western European countries have much bigger states than we do. But the beef we have, I think, is the way that this is paid for. Now, a good chunk of that with much higher levels of borrowing. Now, again, we've just been discussing that some higher borrowing may be possible, but we shouldn't claim that that is in any sense painless, but with no, in their manifesto, clarity about how you would deal with that ever-increasing debt. They've also got some plausible policies on tax, reforming council tax and so on, which is something we'd be absolutely getting behind, but that's a pretty small part of what they're looking at. A wealth tax is in their manifesto, again, possible, probably wouldn't raise enormous amounts, but certainly something that's possible. And then 90 billion a year from a carbon tax. Now, a carbon tax is a good way of dealing with climate change, but 90 billion a year is a very big number. That would make a huge difference to the economy. Of course, that's the intention. But you would probably need to spend most of that, any money that you raised from that on compensating people, because this would result in significant economic change. It would result in the costs of lots of necessities rising and rising potentially quite fast. So that money wouldn't actually be available for spending on the public services that you might want. So again, you've got these very, very big numbers, a sort of implication that this very big increase in spending could be done in a relatively painless way. And I think what we need, I think, is actually a serious debate about what we think about the appropriate size of the state. Is it about right at the moment, as Labour and Conservatives seem to imply? Should it be bigger in the way that the Greens rather imply? Should it be smaller in the way that Reform rather imply? But if you're going to get there, what are the actually difficult, tough decisions that you're going to make? Who's actually going to pay extra tax if you want a bigger state? Who's actually going to lose out from cutting spending if you want a smaller state? And actually, I'd really like it if we had parties that were more different, that were credible on this. I think the worry is that we've got these smaller parties that are quite different, but haven't got to the point of working out really credible policies to achieve that difference. So I'm not sure all of my colleagues entirely agree with that. I mean, Helen, what's your view of that?
I think two things can both simultaneously be true. One is that we can welcome having lots of new ideas in the debate. I think, you know, the two main parties' manifestos are pretty boring and unambitious if you take them at their word. So I think having a debate that includes, you know, things like a carbon tax, that's great. We should absolutely be thinking about a carbon tax, what it would look like, what level it should be set at, how quickly do we want to transition. So I think all of that is very welcome. I think the new ideas. It's also true, and I think I agree here, it's true that the kind of problem with some of the manifestos is that they're not blueprints for government. You couldn't just take the manifesto into government and implement it, meaning you would have to do something different. You'd have to scale back your ambitions and therefore not achieve as much as you were hoping, so not have such a big carbon tax or not cut taxes by so much in Reform's case. Or you'd need to find something else to do to put forward your plans. I think that's the point you're getting at, Paul. It's like there's something else you would need to do that we're not being told about. And usually something else you'd need to do is the bit that's the trickiest bit. It's the bit that, like you said, who would face the spending cuts or who would face the extra tax rises. So absolutely not that you can't do it, and absolutely not that we shouldn't be debating it. I think we absolutely should be debating it. I'd love more of this debate. But almost just pushing to go a little bit further and say, can we just have this debate but with a bit more information around it that makes it a higher quality debate, so we can make proper choices about, you know, do voters really realise if you wanted a size of the state, the sort of the Green Party size of the state, what would that really mean for the average person, you know, tax. If we do want to transition to net zero really quickly, you know, what would that mean in terms of consumers seeing their bills and things going up? Or if you want something like Reform, you want a really much smaller state, you know, that option available, but what would you start to cut? Which bit of government do you want is the marginal bit you want to chop off? So yeah, I think we can both, you know, welcome the kind of big ideas, trying to shape the debate, trying to get good ideas in there, while also saying, but please can we have some more information that makes it a fuller discussion?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. More information and therefore more clarity for people that these are difficult choices. They're either going to have worse benefits and worse public services in the Reform case, or they're going to have significantly higher taxes, which will impact people and not just in any kind of victimless way if you have a bigger state. And in a sense, this is the sort of really boring thing we've been saying for years and years and years. You can have a smaller state. The US, for example, has a smaller state than we do, but it has a very ungenerous benefit system, for example. You can have a bigger state like a lot of Western Europe does, but every one of those bigger states in Western Europe taxes people on average incomes more than we do. I think it would be fair to say that's right, isn't it, Helen?
Well, if you look at other countries that raise more than us in Western Europe and you ask how their tax systems are different, they stand out in having high taxes at the middle. So they also tax the top more, but it's the middle where we look most different. That's where we stand out as being, we tax the middle relatively less compared to countries that raise more than us.
That's our worry, really, with where we are with the manifestos. We've got two from the main parties, which look very status quo-ish and aren't really providing big choices. And then we've got the sort of radical right and radical, I think you can think of the Greens as a more of a radical left party, offering, you know, genuinely big different choices, but without really spelling out, without at all actually spelling out what the impacts of those choices might be. Let's move on. We've got another question here about what happens after the election. I don't think we know the answer to this, but it's an interesting question. Does the IFS have any sense of when the next spending review or autumn budget will be, or what its scope will be? Christine, do we know when the spending review will be?
I mean, if anyone listening to this knows when the spending review will be, or indeed when the budget will be, that would be very helpful information for us as we try
and... a postcard.
I'd just say perhaps we should look at the bookies' odds.
Yeah. Do tell us if you know what it is. If you're psychic or something, do tell us. We'd really like to know. It would help us a lot in planning our outputs over the next few months. So I don't think we do know exactly when it's going to be. What we do know is that the current spending review sets departmental budgets through to April next year. That does not mean that you can push the spending review out until April next year. So really, you have to have something done latest, essentially December this year, because local government and other areas of the state just need that certainty. And even if you push it that late, even if you wait until December, you still have a risk that you're not giving a lot of these other government bodies a lot of time to figure out what money they're going to have to play with. And that means that there's a risk that some of their decisions are suboptimal. It's really hard to do long-term planning if you don't have a sense, even indicatively, of what your budget might look like over the next period of time. I think another question with the spending review is going to be how long a period it ends up covering. So one thing that we've seen quite a few times recently, actually, has been that we have kind of one-year spending reviews that top up budgets, set those plans, avoid that sort of really disaster cliff edge, no one knows what they have to spend, but say, actually, there's a lot of uncertainty here. We really need to wait and see before we start making big multi-year decisions about what direction we want to take our public services in. So that's one option on the table. Another option would be if Rachel Reeves and her team do win the election and come in and they say, look, we have a really clear sense of what we'd like to have happen, and actually we're ready. We think we're ready to go. We're going to do a multi-year spending review. That would be an option that their team would have available, or indeed that the Conservative Party would have available to them as well. In terms of the scope of the spending review or the budget, I mean, I think this is the point that we've repeated ad infinitum on this podcast is, you would hope that the manifestos would give you some sense, some leading indicator of what the scope might be or what some of the decisions might be. And we have a little bit of that. Under the Conservatives, we would see less spending on working age welfare. We would see some larger tax cuts, particularly on national insurance. Under the Labour Party, there's a little bit of a top up to public spending, but it really is relatively small. But, the big question here, like we talked about on the last episode, is we just don't have a baseline. We just have no sense, really, of what these budgets might look like. And so essentially it's all to play for whoever comes into government next, because they really have a lot of freedom, particularly the Labour Party, whose manifesto avoided making very many commitments on how public service budgets would evolve. They have a lot of freedom to really make, and if they want to, very, very different decisions indeed about how these budgets are set.
I think you counted 17 reviews that they promised. Is that right?
Reviews and strategies. You have to bring them both together, but a huge number. I think what we don't know is how quickly those reviews, strategies either would start or would conclude. And so there's a real question there of whether the strategy for a Labour government would be to say, look, we want to get these reviews done as a priority. We're going to do a one-year spending review. We're going to set some interim budgets. And then once we have all of that information back in at pace, we're going to use that to inform a longer-term spending review. If you instead go down the route of doing a multi-year spending review at the moment and setting budgets much further out, it doesn't make it impossible to change direction later on, but it does make it much harder. It means you're working from a firmer baseline, and that means you have a little bit less flexibility to really be guided by all of the reviews and strategies that you're bringing in.
That feels to me like quite a strong argument for, unless there's a lot more work that's gone on behind the scenes than we're aware of. It feels to me like quite a strong argument for a relatively narrowly scoped fiscal event in the autumn. Certainly in terms of spending, maybe just a one-year spending review, and then coming back a year later, having done a lot of the reviews and the strategizing and so on, with something that then maybe covers the whole of the rest of the Parliament. Now, obviously, the political pressure will be to do some exciting things up front, and there is still, you could still do some exciting things on tax up front. But I think from what I've seen, as I say, unless things are being worked up much more than is in the public domain, Feels to me like a Labour government would be fairly well advised to take it relatively steady in a first fiscal event, and really, do a lot of work over the following year before tying itself to long-term plans. Everyone around the table is nodding. People listening won't be able to see that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I'm right in saying that what's going to happen in practical terms is that, let's assume Labour wins. The ministers will be golfed to their departments. They might have a broad sense of what they want to do, not what they're telling us, but let's imagine they behind the scenes have a broad sense of how they want to do things. I guess they're going to still need to have lots of briefings with civil servants in those departments, get up to speed with this. So you might know behind the scenes that you want to prioritise local government or prisons or something. Everyone should know the prisons are full because it's not a secret. But there's some of the more nitty gritty about all the different line items. That's going to take someone some time to, I assume, to get their heads around, have all their briefings, form their judgments, go back to the Treasury and have those debates, which I think also pushes in that direction of, because it's a new government. And all those briefings will need to happen. I assume pushes in the same direction of don't hurry it.
And it's going to be really hard work being the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. The Chief Secretary to the Treasury is the person in government who is essentially responsible for making everything add up in terms of the spending commitments. Because you can bet that every department at the moment, expecting a new government, is going to be lining up the list of things that absolutely have to happen unless so that catastrophe is avoided, whether that is building more prisons or giving doctors or teachers a pay rise or getting rid of the two-child limit on universal credit or finding lots of extra money for the health service if you really want to get the 18-week get down to 18-week waiting lists, and so on and so on. So the hardest job as ever is going to be those sitting in the centre in the Treasury who are going to be bombarded with demands. And again, some thought on that's going to be necessary. It's also interesting, I think the Labour Party kind of is setting out quite a lot of kind of cross-government missions, which is we'll see how that works. I quite like the idea of cross-government missions, because often governments are rightly criticised for doing things in a very siloed way. And obviously a lot of our big economic and social problems cut across health and local government and the welfare system and transport and education. I mean, they really do cut across. But that again is going to take quite a change in the way that government works. That's going to be quite a culture change for the civil service. It's going to take quite a lot of effort to get there. So again, that speaks to me of a need to me making these not to be trying to do too much too soon. That all sounds terribly boring of us, doesn't it? They do too much too soon. But actually, if a lot of this is announced within a year to 18 months, that will be a lot pretty quickly at the beginning of a 5-year Parliament. We're probably running towards the end of our time here. I mean, there are lots and lots of other questions here that we could be answering. I'm going to take one more, because, again, it's the sort of thing that a number of people talk about, and it's, again, a question that we were asked at the manifesto. Our manifesto analysis didn't have time to answer, and the questioner says, is it time to swallow hard, it may well be time for that, whatever, and let retired people take on a higher burden of tax in order to ease the burden a bit for younger people? And I think this speaks to the sort of general sense that the older generation has done relatively well over the last, not just 10, but 20, 25 years relative to the younger generation. Carl, do you want to kick us off on that? I mean, it might be worth starting by reminding people that this government, despite the narrative, has actually increased taxes on pensioners in a way that it hasn't increased taxes on people on average earnings.
And in fact, if you start the clock in 2010, the then coalition government was increasing the personal allowance, the point at which people started to pay income tax, really quite sharply. But pensioners didn't benefit to the same extent because they were phasing out and then got rid of an enhanced tax allowance for pensioners. Then more recently, we've had those tax thresholds frozen, which basically imposes more income tax on both the working age population and the pensioner population. But then subsequent to that, Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, has been cutting the rate of national insurance, which gives money back to those of working age with earned income, it's not doing anything for those over state pension age. So if you see the national insurance cuts as a kind of compensation, if you like, partial compensation for the big squeeze coming from freezing income tax rates, that's only supporting the working age population. It's not supporting the pensioner population. Stepping back from that a little bit, it's certainly worth noting that average incomes amongst pensioners, once you adjust for housing costs and the fact they don't tend to have children in their households, those average incomes are about the same as a working age household, which is remarkable in the sense that we normally think that when people retire, their income's likely to go down. We don't think people, in the jargon, we don't think people need 100% replacement rates. We think that you can get the kind of same, the same level of quality of living with a lower income in retirement than what you have in working life, at least on average. And you tend to think that economic growth means that younger generations will be richer than older generations. And of course, as we started this podcast, we haven't had much economic growth over the period since 2008. So all of that might point you to say, well, maybe we should put taxes up on pensioners by more than the working age population. That would be a political choice. I don't think there's no obvious thing in the Labour Party manifesto that would move us in that direction. And in the Conservative Party manifesto, they explicitly want a higher tax allowance for income tax allowance for pensioners. But of course, they also want more national insurance cuts, which would benefit the working age population.
And Helen, I think we're in this remarkable place, aren't we, where a higher fraction of the over pension age population are paying income tax than of the population below pension age.
It's only slightly higher, but yeah, it's the first time ever, really, you have a bigger share of pensioners paying income tax than the working age. It partly just speaks to the fact that income growth for pensioners has been much higher. So they're paying more tax, not simply because we're trying to tax them more, but because they're doing better. They have higher incomes.
It's partly because, of course, they've all basically got a state pension, and let's not forget, there are quite a lot of people of working age. People who are married to people who are earning, for example, or students who may actually have almost no income, and there are very few pensioners who've got almost no income.
Yeah. It's also worth saying, and this is just saying what Carl said earlier a different way, we do tax pensioner incomes lower than we tax working age incomes, because we apply national insurance to working age incomes. If you have earned incomes, we do not apply national insurance to pension incomes. So obviously what Carl said is completely true. Tax has been changed in such a way that it's benefited working age people, and it's been slight tax increases for the pensioners, but it's really eroding a benefit as opposed, I think. It's narrowing the gap between pensioners and working age people. It's not, pensioners do not pay more taxes, are not taxed at higher rates than working age people.
They're taxed at lower rates.
They're taxed at lower rates, exactly.
They pay national insurance. We might, of course, the question may also be getting at the fact that most of the wealth of the population sits among the older generation, and we might think about, we probably haven't got time to talk about how you could change the taxation of housing, for example, because the average pensioner is often sitting in a more expensive house, and we have a regressive council tax. I don't actually know. Do we know who pays capital gains tax by age? Is this something that's more paid by older people?
We don't exactly. I mean, it's definitely skewed to the older ages, but of course, what makes it tricky is that it's very lumpy. So people will be accruing capital. If you think of business capital gains, someone's got a business, they'll accrue them over their lifetime, and they'll pay them at the point where they happen to be old, because that's when they're retiring. But that doesn't really mean that it's just old people who have the wealth. It's kind of it's a cumulative thing. But yeah, people tend to, big assets that have capital gains tend to be realised later in life on average, and therefore older people, I think, are more likely to pay it. But I don't know quite how skewed it is. And again, we have to remember that capital gains accrue over time.
And of course, it's forgiven at death. So once you get to a particular age, you might well just hold on to capital gains.
Yeah, dying's a great way to avoid capital gains tax.
You heard it here first. You want to avoid capital gains tax, just die. Which is actually a serious point.
Other options available.
So if you want to avoid inheritance tax, staying alive is quite a good strategy.
Yeah. Oh, trade-offs.
There's not much that gets past us here at the IFS. We are probably going to have to end here. I mean, actually, we should do this again in non-election time. We've had lots and lots of really good questions, and as hopefully you can tell, we've actually rather enjoyed discussing them. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for these special election-focused episodes of the IFS Zoom In. We hope you found them useful, informative, and entertaining. We are the holders of the Reithian flame here, and the decision on who will lead our country now rests, of course, in all of your hands. And if it rests in the hands of people who've listened to the IFS Zooms In, then those hands are safe hands. We'll be back after the election, providing analysis of the action of the new government. Looking forward to this initial budget and spending review, which we expect in the autumn. And as ever, we'll take some deep dives into some of the other big issues facing the country. So to see more of our work, do visit us on www.ifs.org.uk, and do consider supporting us. Consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We will see you next time.